point, you've described your program, you've set your evaluation focus, you've defined, at least at a high level, your evaluation questions. The next step you're going to take is to make choices about data collection sources and methods. But before you do that, you're going to need to broach this idea of setting indicators and decide whether you need indicators or not. So in this module, we're going to talk about the why and the how of developing indicators. Then we're going to use that to frame choices we make about data collection and analysis. And then we're going to talk a little bit at the very end about using mixed methods effectively. Indicator development is a bridge between the evaluation focus that you've already set and the data collection sources and methods that you're going to choose. Indicators are specific, observable, and measurable characteristics that show the progress towards a specific activity or outcome. Now, it's important to remember, not every evaluation question is going to need an indicator. Sometimes your evaluation questions are already so tangibly phrased that an indicator isn't really needed. But just as often, the elements in your evaluation questions are very vague or abstract, and you're going to benefit from trying to make them more tangible before you proceed to data collection. So what's the purposes of an indicator? Indicators are that gray area between the abstract concepts, which are often framed in our evaluation questions, and the methods and sources of data collection, which are very specific. The fancy name for what we're going to do is to operationalize these concepts. So indicators operationalize. They take something abstract and they restate it in a more tangible or a concrete way. In so doing, these indicators help give us a head start on choosing the best data collection sources and methods. Once I have to define vague terms like timely or quality or improved, often it'll lead me to realize that I'm supposed to collect data in this way as opposed to that way. A final point is that if your evaluation is proceeding from a strategic plan that includes goals and objectives, and you've been subjected to the discipline of coming up with SMART objectives, specific, measurable, actionable, realistic, and time-bound, then your indicator work is probably done for you. In fact, you have more detail than you may need for an indicator. So don't go looking for additional work. If you have objectives, they'll often suffice as both process and or outcome indicators at this step. Selecting good indicators. There's really 3 points I really want to emphasize here. The first is what's called construct validity. Whatever the indicator is going to measure, it needs to be about that thing, not about something else related to it. So if I'm measuring quality, then the indicator needs to be about quality. If I'm measuring timeliness, the indicator needs to be about timeliness. The second is the trap that people most often fall into in setting indicators, where they're not measuring the activity or the outcome itself. They're measuring instead the fruits or the so what of that activity or outcome. So if I want to measure, did I implement training correctly, I'll say, well, what constitutes a measure of good training? Well, people learn something. Well, no. The measure of training is going to be something related to, did I implement the training? Did I implement it according to plan? The fact that people learn from it is an important thing, but that's an outcome. It's a fruit of this thing I call a good training. The third point is that we want at least one indicator for each activity or outcome of interest, but depending upon how abstract the thing we're measuring is, we may need multiple ones. The fancy name for this is triangulation, and we'll spend a little bit of time on that later. Again, there are millions of reasons to come up with indicators, and some programs are very specific about how they use this term, and others are very vague about how they use this term. I really have a very modest ambition at this step, and that's simply to take the things that are very abstract and make them a little bit more concrete. But those indicators on the right-hand side of this table are all acceptable indicators of my more general concept, timely jail screening. Which one you choose is going to be totally up to you or up to your program or up to whatever format that your provider or authorizer has set for you. But if the concept in my logic model is timely jail screening, you can see how each one of those indicators makes that concept a little bit more tangible and concrete, but does so very differently. So in the first one, it just means inmates are screened prior to release. In the second one, I add a percentage to it. That's perfectly acceptable for an indicator to have that format or not. In the third one, I'm most specific of all. Not only do I have a percentage, but I have a target for that percentage. Not only is it any inmate, it's a specific class of inmate, and not only screened before release, 24 hours of booking, a very specific timeliness standard for this. Okay? All of those are indicators. All of those are acceptable. The one that's going to be right for you is going to depend upon your situation. Now let me illustrate how all these steps fit together. So here's an intervention we did called Provider Education and Immunization, whose goal was to get private providers to be doing more immunizations. We went through the process of describing the logic model, setting the focus. We decided that there were two independent evaluation focuses, and when we combine them together, these are the parts of the logic model that were most prominent. right? So these boxes in red here are the things we determined were the elements of the program that needed to be part of our evaluation focus. What I do next is I convert that into a very simple measurement table. On the left-hand side, I've simply repeated the content of those boxes from the evaluation framework. From the evaluation logic model. And on the right-hand side, I've converted each of these into indicators. Now, this is busier than you're ever going to have time to look at right now, so I want to focus your attention on just those elements that are in bold. And so I took two elements from that logic model and focus your attention on how I developed indicators for each of them. The first one was the outcome, providers attend trainings and rounds. Now notice I have 4 indicators for that. Why don't I just have one? Well, in this case, it's because there's a lot of nuances to who I want at those trainings, and one indicator wouldn't get it. I'm certainly interested in do a lot of people show up or does nobody show up, but I'm also interested in who actually stays and completes it. That may be the power of this training. It may be that there's really an element of the disciplines I want represented there. I don't just want all infectious disease providers. I may also want nurses, or I may want nurse practitioners. And the final one was perhaps this is a case where I'm trying to change the norm throughout the state. Well, in that case, I need to reach a tipping point of participants from every region of the state. Right? I'm not advocating any one of these indicators. I'm just pointing out how valid some, most, or all of these would be depending upon your situation. The second bolded area is another outcome. Providers receive and use the toolkit. And here I chose multiple indicators, but for a completely different reason. Here, I can measure it by asking the providers if they use the toolkit or not, perhaps through some sort of survey. But perhaps I don't trust their response. I think they're not going to tell me the truth because they want to please me or they want to feel like the toolkit was useful. And so I add a second method of a second indicator which draws in another method called a call to action card. A call to action card is something that shows up perhaps in the middle of the document, offering an opportunity for more information, or an opportunity to participate in a raffle, or an opportunity to get a personal visit, or whatever. The fact that someone fills it out and sends it in tells me, well, here's a provider that actually engaged at some level with the information. So here's an example where multiple indicators are helpful. They're each getting at a slightly different nuance. Now, when we turn from indicators to actually choosing data collection sources, as in every step of our framework, the goal is always seeking use of findings. So the collection choices we're going to make here are which data collection choices are most going to lead to the actual use of findings by the people for whom these findings are being collected. And of course, as always, the standards are going to play a role in this. Now you'll notice when we talk about steps 4 and 5 of our framework that we don't call them collect data and analyze data, even though those are really the core tasks, but rather gather credible evidence and justify conclusions. Why? Because the groundwork we laid in those earlier steps means we're not just collecting data, we're collecting data we know to be credible to the audience. Right? That fact is going to lead us to some data collection sources and methods and not others. Likewise, when we analyze data, at this point we know already the prism of values, expectations, and preferences people are going to interpret that data through. And that's going to help us make sure we're producing data that justify our conclusions. When we think about characterizing data collection methods and sources, there are 3 main ways. Qualitative and quantitative is probably the one you're most familiar with. But I want to touch on each of these because we'll see how they come into play when we use some examples. The first is primary versus secondary. When I'm collecting the data for the first time for purposes of my project, I'm collecting primary data. On the other hand, there are occasions where I'm able to draw on existing data sources like the census or surveillance data or BRFSS or YRBS. Those are called secondary data. They don't exist for my program, but I'm able to use them in my evaluation. The second distinction is obtrusive versus unobtrusive measures. To what degree does the respondent know that data are being collected on them? Right? Now, there are cases where obtrusiveness doesn't matter. When I'm filling out a survey, I clearly know I'm being probed for my attitudes and beliefs, and it may matter, it may not, and what I write down is my survey response. In other cases, I may be worrying about a sensitive issue, and it's of the essence that I collect the data in a way that is unobtrusive. And so I look for ways to collect things passively or through secondary data or in some other way where the respondent is not aware of of data being collected on them. The most common way we think about data are quantitative and qualitative. And again, these terms are exactly what they imply. Quantitative refers to quantity. It's data that are collected that deal with numbers and data which can be measured in some mathematical way. Height, volume, weight, speed, the sorts of things we're used to expressing in numbers. By contrast, qualitative data get at more abstract or subjective qualities. So here we're dealing with descriptions. We can observe the data, but we can't necessarily measure them. Colors, textures, tastes, appearance, beauty. We can rank things on a scale of beauty, but it's not going to be the same kind of scale that can say, I'm twice as tall as somebody else. Something may be smellier than something else, but we can't say this is twice as smelly as this other thing, the way I might be twice as rich as someone else. How do we collect data? There are four major sources of data: people, documents, observation, and what we already talked about, secondary data. The people side is the one we're probably most familiar with. We can collect it through surveys. We can collect it through interviews where we see the person one-on-one. We can do those interviews personally, or we do them in groups, focus group being the most obvious example of a group interview situation. How we decide which methods to choose is always going to be informed by our standards, just like everything else we do in our evaluation framework and all the other decisions we made in this focus step. Right? Here are some of the common ways in which the standards play out. So our standards are utility, feasibility, propriety, and accuracy. As it relates to choosing data collection methods and sources, utility is going to ask, what is the purpose of the data collection? Does that lead us to choose this data source as opposed to another? Feasibility is a really key one here. How much time and how much budget can I really throw to data collection? That's clearly going to influence whether we choose this method or that method. Propriety are the ethical concerns. Am I dealing with a sensitive issue such that I really need to worry for ethical reasons about anonymity or confidentiality? Well, clearly that's going to lead us to look at some data sources more than others. And then finally, accuracy. How accurate and valid do the data need to be in this situation, this time, right? And again, accuracy is going to be in the service of utility and feasibility, as it always is, but it's going to help us decide this is the data collection method I need to use in this case. Now here's a simple matrix I created which combines the last two sets of points we made. In column 1, I've listed all the methods of data collection we've talked about, the various types of surveys and personal interviews, focus groups, document review, observation, and then at the bottom, secondary data. Across the top, I've talked a little bit about the criteria that might come into play when we make these data collection choices. And we can see how these crosswalk very easily to the evaluation standards. Time and cost, clearly part of the feasibility standard. Sensitive issues and Hawthorne effect, clearly related to the accuracy standard. You know, if the issue is sensitive and or someone is aware that they're being observed, which is what the Hawthorne effect is about, clearly that may distort the accuracy of what they're telling me. And ethics, obviously just another statement, another way of stating the propriety standard, right? So in any situation, I'm always going to look at the criteria that are most relevant, and I'm going to choose the methods and sources that maximize those criteria. So here's 3 examples. I'm going to walk them through one by one. In each case, I'm going to tell you what we did and which of the criteria most came into play in making that decision. These are all examples from real life, from studies I was involved in the past. In this study, the study was much broader than this, but the one element I'm calling out here is we wanted a point-in-time estimate of the percentage of juniors in our subject high schools who had a sexual encounter by the end of their junior year. So at the end of the junior year, we were doing this, we were trying to collect this data. Well, when I look at my matrix of data collection methods and sources, the thing I'm most worried about is this is a very sensitive issue. And so when I look at the worst and the best methods of collecting this, if I had you and we could have a discussion, I bet we'd all conclude the worst method is going to be a focus group. Why? Because the introduction of peers is going to distort clearly what anyone says in response. So here's a case where a point-in-time estimate really requires as much anonymity and separation from the respondent and the interviewer and other people as possible. And this is true for just about every point-in-time estimate we want on a sensitive issue. We want to be as anonymous as possible so that we don't distort the response of the person we're collecting data on. So in this case, I'm probably going to go with a mail survey or a personal survey that they fill out. I can sometimes draw on some of these newer techniques of phone surveys or personal interviews where the person's answering on a computer, even though I'm there to be able to observe and probe if needed. Right? By contrast, I chose this second example because it's also a sensitive issue, but you'll see that when we look at what we're trying to get out of this, we choose completely different data sources. So in this case, a client gave me a sample of a survey they wanted to collect. The survey asked very, very pointed questions related to had people been victimized by intimate partner violence, and the specifics of the last incident of intimate partner violence. It was clearly something you would never get past an institutional review board or human subjects. When we asked the client, their response was that they were not at all interested in the percentage of people who'd been victimized by intimate partner violence. Rather, they wanted to identify enough people who had been in incidents so that they could get more understanding of the dynamics of the incident, because they believed they could identify patterns in what would keep an incident from escalating and teach people coping mechanisms. Well, in this case, it's a sensitive issue. You might say, well, gosh, we should default to a survey and anonymity. Well, in this case, that's exactly the worst choice for ethical reasons, if nothing else. Here, we want to understand the surrounding behavior. We want the opportunity to probe. So we want to move to something that creates a rapport and a relationship with the respondent. Now, in this case, I might use a personal interview. In this case, we had very little time to do this, and so we used focus groups. Now, we did that with some trepidation for fear that, just like with our juniors in high school, the presence of other people would distort the response. But in this case, because we were trying to understand the dynamics of the incident, the presence of other people in a supportive environment actually helped us and gave us better results than we might have gotten even from a personal interview. In the third example, we have many, many ways of trying to reduce the lead burden in households that have lead-poisoned kids. One of the ways we try increasingly is to get the householder to adopt fairly aggressive housekeeping and nutrition behaviors, eating iron-rich foods, particularly greens, spinach, etc., and adopting this very aggressive discipline of keeping the dust levels down in the house, and vacuuming the house often, using a special cleaning solution. Right? Now, our first intent was to collect this information by survey and ask someone, say, a year after participating in the intervention or a few months after participating in the intervention, the degree to which they had adopted these housekeeping and nutrition behaviors. We quickly discerned that this was going to lead to socially desirable responses. The average parent is certainly not going to admit that, no, they're not dusting their house as often as they should. They're not giving their kid as much spinach as they should, because they know this is exactly what they need to do to reduce the lead burden. So while we did the survey, we had to supplement it with other more passive methods of measuring whether the behavior was being adopted or not. We had two in play in different places. One was more unsavory than the other, but let me describe both of them. So in the first case, we actually did a little bit of analysis of garbage. A lot of our host folk were living in brownstones. We could identify their garbage cans from other garbage cans. Well, you can't guarantee the spinach was eaten, but you can guarantee from looking at the garbage that it was served. Unless people poured the cleaning solution down the sink, the presence of an empty bottle tells you that someone actually is using the cleaning solution aggressively in their house. Again, that gives you a little bit more certainty that the behavior has been adopted. The second method, because investigating the garbage is such an unsavory invasion of privacy, was we gave people coupons redeemable at the local stores. Again, these were poor neighborhoods. People tended to shop at local convenience stores and not travel miles to the supermarket. And so it worked quite well for us. People had coupons to redeem for the cleaning solution, for vacuum bags, for greens, for spinach. And then we could monitor the redemption of those coupons. Now, there's always the chance that the presence of the coupon distorted the behavior. Nevertheless, we felt persuaded that if we were getting some evidence of redeeming coupons, people were actually adopting the behaviors. Okay? Now, in all three cases, you can see we have a fairly sensitive issue. Did you lose your virginity? Are you adopting aggressive housekeeping and nutrition behaviors? Tell me more about the last incidents of intimate partner violence. Yet in each case, for different reasons, we defaulted to different methods of collecting the data. So let's look at this matrix again and think again about our provider education and immunization example. So remember, here are the indicators we came up with for the focus from our evaluation logic model, and our eye is drawn to those two groups that I bolded. Well, now in this table, I've simply put those same indicators in the left-hand column, and on the right-hand side, I've just told you where we might land with methods and sources. And again, you might land someplace completely differently, but I want to talk through how the criteria that we just talked about would play out here, right? In the case of did the right people attend the training, I wanted to know all kinds of things about the participants. Well, luckily, this is something I can collect reasonably passively. People have to sign in for the training. They have to register for the training in advance. And so I can collect this pretty much passively. Not that anyone would lie about these things anyway, but I have this passive data collection source, and it's fairly easy to collect all those items that way. By contrast, with the providers, do they use the toolkit or not? Here's one issue where, just like with the lead poisoning behavior of the parents, I'm a little bit worried I'll get socially desirable responses. So here I want to default to collecting the data in those two ways: a survey to get reported use of the toolkit, but backed up by an analysis of the propensity of people to submit these call to action cards. Okay? Now, as I've already alluded, there are cases where we don't trust any one method, and so we resort to what we call mixed methods. And mixed method simply means the combination of generally a qualitative and a quantitative method in a single study, but it also connotes that I'm doing this to supplement or complement the validity, reliability, my certainty about the information I'm getting. Right? There are a bunch of reasons to use mixed methods, and we have a separate tutorial on this that will delve into these in more detail. But at a very high level, I want to make just a couple points about mixed methods. We call the reasons we delve into mixed methods the C's and the E's. Sometimes the purpose of mixed methods is corroboration or clarification. I'm using mixed methods because I want to understand something more defensively or be sure that what I'm seeing is actually true. So the fancy name we used for this was triangulation. I'm going to use a mixed method because I want to make sure that what a provider told me in the survey is actually backed up by some other observation of their behavior. I want to make sure that the mom says she's feeding her kids spinach 5 days a week, but I see some evidence of that in the garbage or the redeeming of the coupons. By contrast, in other cases, I'm using mixed methods because I'm trying to explain or explore. So here I'm trying to understand the backstory or what's behind the what I'm observing. Right? So here I'm looking perhaps for induction. There's a new phenomenon. I don't even know where to start looking for patterns. And so I use a qualitative method to see, are there any patterns that I can sense? Or in the case of intimate partner violence, it wasn't how many people had been in intimate partner violent incidents. It was rather trying to understand completely what was the dynamics of those incidents. So it's a really quick overview of data collection sources and methods and the criteria we use to make the choices. These last few points about mixed methods are delved into in its own webinar, which you can click on for more information.